Between 1300 and 1600 AD, a gradual but marked change came over Europe, the initial center of activity being in Italy. Men sensed that things were not as they should be, and they looked back to the past brilliant glories of Rome, the Rome of pagan times, when everything seemed to have been so much better. The art and literature, architecture, and lore of the old empire were unearthed, dusted off, and copied, to improve man's enjoyment of the present life. Thinking particularly from the time of the barbarian invasions, as the Dark Ages, but in general they do not seem to have realized then, as many realized later, that the union of church and state had been the cause of the darkness. How was it that the promotion of the Holy Church of Jesus Christ to exclusive supremacy in the empire, hand in hand with the secular administration, a marriage celebrated so happily by Eusebius, did not guarantee the protecting hand of the Almighty against civil and agricultural calamities and ferocious foreign invasion? If this was the veritable image of the kingdom of Christ, as Eusebius had proclaimed, what had gone wrong? Did they not stand in supreme veneration of the unfathomable mystery of the Trinity, adore the image of the Holy Virgin, Mother of God, obey the dictates of the representatives of the blessed Saint Peter, and execrate those terrible Christ killers, the Jews, and burn them, and all heretics at the stake, to save them from an everlasting inferno? I will let you draw your own conclusions. The lesson of Spain was there for all to see, had they wanted to. The tolerant treatment of the Jews under the Muslims had coincided with a distinct improvement in that country's fortunes, in education, prosperity and the general well-being of the population. But the attempts to force conversion of the Jews to so-called Christianity, with the subsequent setting up of the Inquisition to protect their souls, had plunged the peninsula back into darkness. Roman Catholicism was the blight of Europe. Taken overall, even the Greek Catholics in the East fared somewhat better than their Roman counterparts. It was not without significance that the rebirth, that is the Renaissance, of the past glories got underway without the presence of the papacy. Feuding among the Italians and the French over the election of the Supreme Pontiff resulted in the popes transferring to France from 1305 AD. For about 70 years, there they lived in luxury at Christendom's expense, incurring, as a result of papal taxation, the annoyance of everyone, and of the English in particular. The year 1378 saw the election of two popes, one Italian and one French, in Rome and in Avignon, in France, where the popes had taken up residence, and the empire of the beast was thrown into utter confusion. The leadership of a divinely sanctioned successor to Saint Peter was of paramount importance to the Catholics. The Holy Ghost did not seem to be giving a clear direction during the advent of the Great Schism, as it has been termed. Another pope was then elected to replace the first two, but since they refused to step down, Christendom now had three popes. The new pope was quickly succeeded by another, who was suspended under charges of fornication, adultery, incest, sodomy and poisoning, leaving two popes again. It was not until 1417 that a uniformly accepted pope was appointed. The 39-year incident had done considerable damage to papal reputation. Little insight would have been required to see this as clear evidence of the fraudulent nature of the lofty claims made by the man of sin system. During the absence of the papacy, the Italian states in Rome were free from outside interference. At this time also the larger cities were becoming wealthier through trade, a function in which Italy, by its location, played a leading part. In the coastal towns of Genoa and Venice, and the towns along the trade routes, such as Florence and Milan, a new and powerful middle class of merchants and bankers developed. A world of trade and commerce became another factor that caused Renaissance man to look to the past, since it prompted the examination of the codes of ancient Roman law. This in turn led to a study of Greek and Roman classics. Education was expanded to include history, literature and the arts, and a new impetus was provided when Greek scholars fled westwards at the fall of Constantinople in 1453 AD. Such was the return to Roman and Greek culture that the goddesses Fortuna, that is chance, and Occasis, meaning opportunity, became popular emblems of the period. Yet, with the interest shown in pagan deities, men still retained the Catholic concepts of religion. Indeed, the church became the greatest patron of Renaissance art. and indulged in building, restoring, decorating, and collecting to regain some of her lost prestige. Significantly, among other things, the Arch of Titus, symbolizing Rome's victory over the Jews, and the taking of Jerusalem, was restored. The climax of papal patronage was the rebuilding of St. Peter's Basilica, ordered by Pope Julius II, and furthered by Leo X. It was the sale of indulgences for the financing of this project that was instrumental in precipitating the Protestant Reformation. The Renaissance in Northern Europe occurred later than in Italy and did not become as obviously pagan in outlook. In addition to the classics, the Bible was studied, along with Greek and Hebrew languages, in which it was originally written. A new translation in Latin exposed many errors in the official Vulgate version. Indeed, the study of the Bible by the educated classes resulted in criticism of the Church and a demand for simplicity, thus anticipating the Reformation. The printing press, a key factor that would also affect the Reformation, by removing the Bible from the prescriptive custody of the Church, was another major achievement of the Renaissance. The Protestant Reformation. 100 years ago many Protestants looked back with pride to the Reformation, when their forebears broke with Rome in a pioneering back to the Bible spirit, and changed the course of history. Catholics, on the other hand, would have seen it as a heretical movement, but one in which Rome had to share the blame, because of her faults, that helped provoke the Protestant reaction. But the Reformation, so far as its mainstream movements were concerned, was not the break with Rome that men imagined. They may have cast off the hierarchical ties with the Pope, but they were still shackled to Roman dogma and superstition. This may seem a harsh judgment, but those who are well acquainted with Orthodox Protestantism, and have followed this video series thus far, will acknowledge its truthfulness. The fact that today Rome is increasingly becoming the center of universal ecclesiastical consensus, particularly through the Pope, who sees himself as High Priest of the planet, a Super Pontifex Maximus, is in itself an indication of the real basis of the mainstream Protestant movements. Should you doubt this fact, consider the scriptural designation of the woman who sits upon the 7 hills. In Revelation 17 verse 5. And on her forehead was written a name of mystery, Babylon the Great, mother of harlots, and of earth's abominations. Look closely at the phrase, mother of harlots. If Rome is the mother, who are the harlot daughters to whom she has given birth, if not the Protestants, and every other denomination branching off them, all with the same basic Roman beliefs and customs? The Reformation is usually dated from the time when Martin Luther nailed his 95 Theses to the church door in Wittenberg, the 31st of October 1517. That act set in motion a chain of events that inexorably rent the Catholic Church asunder and broke the predominance of papal power in many lands. But Luther was no pioneer in this respect. Down the ages many courageous men had boldly attacked Rome's dogmas and institutions without creating the revolution that followed Luther, and his theses were not as heretical as some of those that had gone before. The Protestant success, if it can be called that, lay in the circumstances of the times, circumstances that favored a reduction of papal power, as the end of what Ezekiel termed the time of the Gentiles came in sight in accordance with Bible prophecy. It is instructive to review those circumstances which provided such a favorable environment for Protestant reform. In the first place, the corruption of the Catholic Church had become glaringly obvious to a growing number of people. The Renaissance had led to a degeneration of morals and an increase in irreligiousness, even within the Church, sufficient to turn some away. The Great Schism fiasco had also shown the political and worldly nature of papal power. When Luther, a clerical teacher in moral philosophy at Wittenberg University, visited Rome in 1510 to 1511 AD, he was shocked at the profanity and lack of piety of the Romans, and of the Pope himself, the Pope being personally involved in warfare at the time. Then came the Church's campaign to raise money for the costly rebuilding of St. Peter's Basilica. The profits that flowed back to Rome from throughout Latindom by way of church taxation, the sale of masses, and fees to adore the relics, though these were insufficient to meet the huge expenses, and they could not be increased without causing even more unpopularity. It seemed the poverty-stricken masses of Europe had been bled to the limit. But the resourceful Pope Leo X opened his treasure chest of spiritual goods, and offered indulgences for sins, past, present, and future. That is the purchase of forgiveness of sins. He sent forth his ecclesiastical salesmen throughout Europe to make them available to the burdened sinners, unlike Israel's God, who offers salvation without price. Ho, everyone who thirsts, come to the waters, and he who has no money, come, buy, and eat. Come buy wine and milk, without money and without price. Why do you spend your money for that which is not bread, and your labor for that which does not satisfy? Hearken diligently to me, and eat what is good, and delight yourselves in fatness. Incline your ear, and come to me. Hear, that your soul may live, and I will make with you an everlasting covenant. My steadfast, sure love for David. Unlike God's promise, indulgences were purchased for cold, hard gold and silver. The living were even encouraged to purchase indulgences for souls in purgatory, with the enticing, but scandalous jingle, as soon as the coin in the coffer rings, the soul from purgatory springs. A river of coin soon flowed back to Rome. In April 1517, the most notorious of the Pope's salesmen, Tetzel, visited Wittenberg, and Luther was constrained to protest against the church abuses through his 95 Theses, which he nailed to the church door. This act of rebellion was soon widely known, the printing press being instrumental in the process. The public was electrified, but the busy Pope paid little heed to this monkish squabble, until it was too late. Eventually Luther was outlawed by the church, but not before he obtained shelter and assistance from German nobility, who had their own axe to grind with the papacy, and who were impressed with Luther's teachings. Some early groundwork for the Reformation had been done by, amongst others, John Wycliffe in England, and John Huss in Bohemia, over 100 years before. Wycliffe had repudiated transubstantiation, special powers of the clergy, compulsory confessions, prayers for the dead, and the worship of relics. He also advocated preaching in the common tongue, and using English Bibles, of which he translated, for the benefit of the ordinary man. He was expelled from Oxford University in 1382, but obtained protection from the state. John Huss was strongly influenced by Wycliffe's writings. He believed that faith should be tested by the Bible, and that popes and clerics should be obeyed only insofar as they complied with it. He condemned papal indulgences. At the Council of Constance, on the 6th of July 1415, he was condemned and executed by being burnt at the stake, notwithstanding the promise of safe passage made to him beforehand, conditional on him attending the council in person. From within the church, Erasmus, a Catholic humanist, was working for reform in Luther's time. In fact, he is said to have laid the egg that Luther hatched. The increasing availability of printed Bibles, even though they were initially only in Latin, was a factor in the Reformation, which cannot be overemphasized. Also, the spirit of humanism, developed in the Renaissance, undoubtedly created a climate of inquiry which favored independent study and worked to the same end. The political climate was another help to Luther. The desire of a section of the German nobility to reclaim papal territorial acquisitions and slow the flow of capital to Rome, as well as the reduction in influence of the loyal Catholic Habsburg Emperor, Charles V, who was preoccupied with international affairs, worked in conjunction with the peasants' disenchantment with the church and their hero worship of Luther. In 1524, the peasants in southern Germany, encouraged by Luther's teaching on freedom and his denouncement of the church, put forward claims for a major relaxation of the feudal system. The movement developed into rebellion, and Luther, fearing it had got out of hand, exhorted the authorities with his natural ferocity to smite, strangle or stab, secretly or publicly, the murderous and thieving rabble of the peasants. Luther's unchristian stand lost him support among the peasantry, and his influence in promoting the uprising also lost him support among the nobility. After Luther's death, Charles V attempted to crush Protestantism. The warring and strife between Protestants and Catholics, however, was ended by the Peace of Augsburg in 1555, which gave Lutheranism legal recognition in Germany. Lutheranism spread throughout Europe, but in Switzerland an independent movement emerged, Calvinism. This reform began with Zwingli in Zurich, who was more radical than Luther, rejecting not only transubstantiation, but Luther's consubstantiation compromise. In 1529 Zwingli was killed in a battle with Catholics, in which he fought as a soldier. John Calvin continued the work in Geneva where, in 1541, in association with the authorities, he set up a rigid theocratic state. Dissidents were excommunicated, exiled, and a few even burned to death. Calvinism spread to France, where its adherents were known as Huguenots. It also took root in Scotland through the work of John Knox. Knox's preaching precipitated civil war when the people began destroying images, churches, and monasteries. After the Treaty of Edinburgh, the largest parliament in Scottish history, convened and abolished papal authority. Religion was to be maintained, and ministers paid, by the state. Under James VI, Knox Calvinism was the compulsory religion in Scotland, with Catholicism being punishable by confiscation of property, exile, or death. Protestantism in England came about as the result of Henry VIII quarreling with the Pope over the divorce of his first wife and the fact that the Pope would not allow him to divorce. In a series of political moves he had himself appointed as head of the church in England, thus being free to divorce and remarry. The general national resentment against Rome's interference in English affairs being the key to his success. However, the creed of the new church outlined in 1543 in the King's Book was essentially Catholic, apart from a nominal emphasis on the authority of the Bible and justification by faith. Thank you for watching. Subscribe to get notifications of new videos. Like, share and comment below.